Israel is continuing to bombard Gaza after heavy airstrikes on Monday night killed over 400 Palestinians, including 174 children, definitively collapsing the fragile ceasefire agreement. The Gaza Health Ministry says at least 436 Palestinians have been killed in the last 2 days, including 183 children. It's also been confirmed that a strike on UN headquarters in Gaza City killed one international aid worker and injured 5 more. Here's Executive Director of the UN Office for Project Services, Jorge Moreira da Silva, speaking about that attack.
You may have known from the last couple hours that reports are coming in that UNOPS colleague has been killed in Gaza following explosions in Deir al-Balah. It's where we have our compound, our guest house, our premises in Gaza. It is understood that this UNOPS premises was hit at approximately 11:30 a.m. this morning. 2 days ago, there was a near miss to this premises, Monday, and yesterday the premises was hit, and today there was another hit, unfortunately, with these casualties. This incident, again, is following activities on deconfliction with the Israeli Defense Forces. I want to stress this point. These premises were well known by the Israeli Defense Forces, and they were deconflicted. And you know what does it mean, deconflicting? It means that everyone knew who was working inside the premises. It is also understood that there are at least 5 additional casualties, several of whom are very severely injured. In addition to this colleague that lost his life, these other 5 colleagues lost their eyes, legs, so they are severely injured following today's attacks.
Israel targeting aid workers and UN facilities has almost been normalized because it's happened so many times now, but it's not at all common in other conflict zones. Israeli ground troops have also retaken the Netzarim corridor, which splits Gaza in half, after withdrawing last month as part of the ceasefire deal. This comes after a new forced displacement order was issued, covering large swathes of the territory. Here's the warning that was distributed, ordering Palestinians to immediately vacate the areas shaded red. Really feels like the early stages of the assault once again. Like it feels like it could be December 2023, January 2024 all over again, which is a tragic case for people in Gaza if that's so. Gazan political analyst Mohammed Shahada says Israel's reoccupation of the Netzarim corridor suggests it is implementing the so-called Five Fingers policy, which divides Gaza into multiple tightly controlled enclaves. Here's part of a Washington Post article from last year on Israel's objectives in the Netzarim corridor. At least 750 buildings have been destroyed in what appears to be a systematic effort to create a buffer zone that stretches at least 500 yards on either side of the road, according to an analysis by Hebrew University's Ali Ben Nun, a geographic data specialist. An additional 250 buildings have been razed in the area of the US pier. The IDF declined to comment on the clearing of buildings around the corridor, saying it would not answer operational questions during an ongoing war. Military experts say it is part of a large-scale, long-term reshaping of Gaza's geography, harking back to past Israeli plans to carve Gaza into easier-to-control cantons. The Netzarim corridor is named after an Israeli settlement that used to sit on the coastal route, the second finger of then-Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon's five-finger strategy that envisioned carving Gaza into segments, all under Israeli security control. The plan was only partially implemented before Sharon, once a champion of settlements, ordered an Israeli withdrawal from Gaza in 2005. While Monday night's carpet bombing was the final nail in the coffin, Israel had already repeatedly flouted the ceasefire deal. Dozens of Palestinians have been killed by IDF airstrikes, artillery, and gunfire under ostensible ceasefire conditions. And for almost 3 weeks now, Israel has prevented all food, water, fuel, medical supplies, and other aid from entering the Gaza Strip. Even before the current total siege, aid was not allowed in at the agreed rate, and some types, such as temporary housing and machinery to clear rubble so that Gazans can start to get the bodies of their killed loved ones out from under those collapsed buildings, were blocked entirely. In response to a question from Jeremy Corbyn, David Lammy told the Commons that Israel's blockade of Gaza breached international law. That was a bold statement by Lammy. But then he was rebuked by Starmer's spokesperson, who insisted Israel was only, quote, at risk of breaching international humanitarian law. I say it was a bold statement by Lammy. When I say bold, I mean true. And it is bold of David Lammy to say true things when it comes to Israel. Emily Thornberry was asked about the implications of Lammy's statement during an interview with LBC, and she gave this response.
Should the government now be putting sanctions on Israel, yes or no?
The government should be working towards a two-state solution, and that's what they need to be doing.
So the answer is no.
It needs to be, listen, there will be a reckoning in the courts, and then the world will know, because there is an international criminal court, and there will be prosecutions, I'm sure.
So has David Lammy got it wrong when he says that Israel is starving children?
I don't know what David knows. I mean, I assume that if aid has been stopped going into Gaza, then people will be running out of food. And it is completely unacceptable. It is completely wrong.
But
and I
not
have
unacceptable
said so
enough to put sanctions on Israel.
When I went to the Knesset a couple of weeks ago and spoke to Israeli politicians and made this perfectly clear. There is no justification for this.
But I don't understand. I don't
think I could be any clearer than I'm being.
Well, I think you could be a lot clearer because you haven't answered the question. You're just diverting it to saying, well, there needs to be a two-state solution. I'm still unclear as to whether you believe there should be sanctions on Israel if they are indeed starving children.
I think that what we need to do is we need to stop them starving children. So then the question is, how do we make them stop? How do we make them stop? Will sanctions make them stop? No. What will make them stop is that there needs to be a solution to this, which is a political solution. And it needs to be that Israel has a way of being safe and secure in its state. But they will not be safe and secure unless there is also a Palestinian state that is able to live alongside.
That is just like classic political kicking something into the very, very, very long grass. Emily Thornberry, of all people, knows that Israelis don't want a two-state solution, the Israeli political class that currently rules the country at least, but also many Israeli citizens, and that Palestinians don't believe that a two-state solution will be respected. And so you can give that kind of answer, sort of gesturing at some kind of impossible situation where we currently stand, and say, well, look, that's the thing that will stop Israel from starving children in Gaza. Sanctions won't do it. Sanctions won't be the thing because, that might put our relationship with Israel at risk. We don't want that. What we want is just to reassure you that if we can somehow achieve this impossible thing, the two-state solution, then the starvation will stop. So let's just pursue this impossible thing rather than doing material, concrete things that we could do now to put pressure on the Israeli government. That is completely off the political table. Pressure on the Israeli government through concrete measures that punish them for the punishment that they're inflicting on Palestinians in Gaza. The fact is, if Israel's blockade of Gaza breaches international humanitarian law, which it self-evidently does, there's really also no tenable justification for the UK continuing to supply weapons to Israel. That's why Starmer is being so careful about wording, to the point of denying the patently obvious. On Politics Live, Nadia Whittam refused to do the same, thank God.
Israel has blatantly violated international law. What the UK needs to do now is hold Israel to account. And we have not just a moral duty, but also a legal duty to do that. And that means a full arms embargo, sanctions like those that we have rightly put on Russia. It means no longer providing diplomatic cover to Israel at the UN. We've got to stand up to the Israeli government and not allow these far-right politicians to do this in the world.
Another person who never minces her words is UN Special Rapporteur on the occupied Palestine territories, Francesca Albanese. Here's what she had to say in an interview with Channel 4 News.
Israel has just killed around 400 people, and this is the acceleration of not a war, of the genocide that is happening in real time. And it has been happening for the past 16 months.
I want to ask you precisely about the legality of what is going on now, because Israel says it is targeting Hamas terrorists. And it says that anybody else killed is a regrettable byproduct of war. Now, what is the legality of what they are doing if they are indeed targeting people they regard as Hamas?
I do not want to downplay the risks that Israel has faced or might still face, but nothing justifies a genocide. And the destruction of life that has taken place over the last 16 months in Gaza, all schools, all hospitals, farming land, and most of the houses, all UN premises. What is this? Why did Israel had to do that? In another situation, would you call a state that hits intentionally and voluntarily hospitals, that starves an entire defenseless population, because this is what it is, would you call it an outcome of war?
It's your use of the word intentionally there that Israel disputes, isn't it? That they say they are not intentionally hitting civilian targets.
What are
they are intentionally hitting Hamas targets. So what is the legal... And that's how they say everything we're doing is legal. So what is your legal analysis of that?
Okay. The legal analysis is then, let's assume that it's a conflict, right? In a conflict, there are rules. And there are a principle of military necessity that Israel claims to have. Well, it is to provide evidence. It is to take precautions. It is to respect the principle of proportionality in every action it takes. There are rules to spare life, to preserve the sanctity of life. And there are obligations. Look, again, this is not debatable. I mean, my intention is not to debate whether it's genocide or not. This is past. We have failed to prevent genocide. And it's not just me saying that. The entire human rights community, there is a wall-to-wall consensus that Israel is committing genocide. Like 2 years ago, there was a wall-to-wall consensus that Israel was maintaining an apartheid regime. And I take it that it's very sensitive for politicians to deal with it. But there are 2 Israeli leaders who are wanted for war crimes and crimes against humanity, including starvation. So even if we don't go to genocide analysis, why member states like the UK have not honored their international obligations to intervene and stop crimes, including because in January 2024, the International Court of Justice, 3 months into this military assault, had concluded that there was a plausibility of risk of genocide.
Mike, Francesca Albanese saying there that there's wall-to-wall consensus internationally that Israel is committing genocide. And I'm pretty sure that there's a lot of consensus amongst civil servants working in government departments, amongst advisors, amongst legal experts who are also in contact with the government, that there is a genocide occurring in Gaza conducted by Israel. So given all of that, how can the UK possibly justify its current position on Israel?
It can't, especially if the UK, presents itself as a defender of human rights. And this government have, by the way, we have Keir Starmer, who has a human rights background, David Lammy, who has a legal background, who will be aware, I'm sure, has a deep knowledge, hopefully, of human rights law and legislation. These are people who are leading our government who should be on the side of defending human rights. Now, there is a consensus, right? There's a consensus in its kind of scholarly work. There's a consensus in the human rights world. There's a growing consensus that Israel committing genocide against Palestinians, right? And what we have is a governments who are simply ignoring this. They might criticize Israel sometimes and some of its acts, but it always stops short of using the word genocide. Now, one of the justifications for this is, well, look, we have to wait for the official rulings and we can't use this language. We have to be very, very careful. But Labour weren't so cautious and careful when it came to Russia's assault on Ukraine. Rightly so, by the way. This is not me saying they shouldn't have said anything and they should just sat on their thumbs. No, Labour were right in speaking out against Russia's aggression in Ukraine, and Labour should have adopted a similar approach when it came to Israel's aggression in Gaza and in the West Bank. It's very, very simple. I think you can't be inconsistent in the defense of justice, in the defense of the most marginalized. You need to be consistent in defending human rights, in upholding human rights. That's what it's all about, consistency. And we're failing to see that from Labour. Instead, what we see is, what Emily Thornberry's saying about, hey, we want a two-state solution, and really being evasive in language and trying to, in many ways, not upset Israel too much. And I read a piece by Owen Jones. It was a really powerful piece, and it was about, the kind of headline of the piece was how different things would be if everyone who could speak out about, Israel's assault on Palestinians did speak out. How different would things be if the UK spoke out unequivocally with no restrictions about what's going on in Gaza? How different would things be? The UK, rightly or wrongly, carry weight on the international stage. If the UK were consistently speaking out against what's happening in Gaza, it would carry weight. It would potentially force other governments in Europe or around the world to reconsider their position. Now, the UK haven't done that. Our government hasn't done that. In fact, our government's done quite the opposite. For so long, our government's actually kind of closed its eyes and said Israel has right to defend itself, right? And now we're seeing some criticism, but that criticism is often, so gently placed to kind of not step on Israel's toes too much, to not be overly critical of Israel. And it's this kind of like political expediency we're seeing from the Labour Party, which is that, we don't want to set one of our closest allies. We want to be really, really careful. But you can't be careful when kids are dying, when families are being torn apart, when a society, when a people are being tormented, are being oppressed, are being killed on a daily basis. You can't be careful. If anything, you need to be, as Owen Jones said, use your voice, use the full weight of your voice to speak out against the acts of horror that we're seeing. And I think the final thing I'll say about Labour governments is, I think history will remember them. I think history will remember this government, will remember the Conservative government as well. And any government that's kind of sitting and not doing anything, or not saying anything about what's going on in Gaza. And history will remember these people in negative ways. We always think about, what would I have done if I was around during, these kind of really horrible things that happened in the past. And everyone always says they would have spoken out against it. People will say, I would have spoken out against the Holocaust, I would have spoken out against the past, etc. And some people who say that definitely would have. And I think people can look back on this period in time. This assault on Gaza, this assault on Palestinian people, this real oppression we've seen, the apartheid regime we saw beforehand. People can speak out about this and be like, well, why weren't governments doing more about this? And I think I completely agree with Owen Jones. If everyone who could speak out did speak out, I think there'll be so much pressure, so much more pressure on Israel. It would force them into a really uncomfortable position. And unfortunately, our government simply is unwilling to use the full weight of its voice to speak out against genocide.
I said earlier that I think, I will, and I think a lot of other people will too, always associate the Labour Party now with the evisceration of the poor in this country. And I also think that I will, and many other people too, always associate the term the Labour Party with genocide now, along with the names Keir Starmer, David Lammy, Emily Thornberry, and countless others. Whenever I hear them, I think that's all I'll think. And I think that's all that lots of other people will think. And I think, the Labour Party, just as it was tainted for so long by the Iraq War, will be for a very, very long tainted by the fact that it did nothing while a genocide unfolded across the world. And it could have spoken out. It could have done something.